Colorado gets 300 days of sunshine a year. It has 400 miles of mountain range, ancient canyon ruins, and the most visited national park in the country. Every year, millions of people walk in. Most of them walk back out. 9 of the people in this video did not. Pull up the map, lock your doors, and let's get into it. July 2nd, 1938, Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. The Beilhartz family had driven up to Estes Park for a vacation. Fishing, hiking, the kind of trip families took in the summer when the mountains were green and the air was clear. Alfred was 3 years old, some sources say 4, the records are disputed. But either way, he was small, blonde, and known to drift toward the back of the group when they walked. That detail matters. Because on a trail running along Fall River, and in a narrow corridor of dense conifer brush and fast mountain water, that's exactly what he did. He drifted back. And then he was gone. His parents turned around. The trail behind them was empty. There was no sound, no cry, no splash. Just a thin path threading through the trees and nothing at the end of it. The search that followed was one of the largest ever mounted in Rocky Mountain National Park at that time. Rangers dammed Fall River and dragged it, the assumption being that a toddler had fallen in and been swept under. They found nothing. Not a shoe, not a piece of clothing, not a single item. Bloodhounds were brought in. Here's the critical detail. The dogs followed a scent trail for exactly 500 feet and then stopped. Not at the water, not at a cliff edge, in the middle of the trail, and they stopped and they wouldn't move forward. Within days, the search had grown to 150 men, including volunteers from the Civilian Conservation Corps. They combed the forest, checked every drainage, surveyed the creek banks downstream. For 10 days they searched. On day 10, they stopped. The official position became what it had been from the start. Alfred had likely drowned, and the body had been carried off by the current. It was the only explanation that fit, except that the creek had been dammed and dragged, and there was nothing in it. The family went home without him. Then, the day after Alfred disappeared, 2 hikers in a completely different section of the park reported something that didn't fit the drowning theory at all. When they were walking along Old Fall Road when they spotted a small boy sitting on a high rocky ledge called Devil's Nest on the face of Mount Chapin. The boy was sitting on the edge of the elevation, they said, for several minutes. And then they described it this way. He was jerked back. Not by his own movement. He was jerked back by someone off to the side, someone the hikers couldn't see clearly from their vantage point. They contacted park officials. Search teams were sent up to the clifftop. Nothing was found. This is where it stops being normal and becomes something else. Devil's Nest is not accessible to a 3-year-old on foot. It's not a place a toddler wanders to by accident. For Alfred Beilhartz to be on that ledge, someone had to take him there. And someone was standing just outside the hiker's line of sight, pulling him back. Weeks later, reports came in from Nebraska. A small boy had been seen walking along a road with an unknown adult male. A photo composite was developed from witness descriptions. The identity of that man was never established. The boy was never confirmed to be Alfred. It remains officially unconfirmed. 5 months after Alfred vanished, a ransom note arrived at his family's home. $500, the note demanded. Police investigated and concluded it was a hoax. The investigation stalled. The creek theory held. The case went cold. But here's what doesn't make sense. The bloodhounds stopped at 500 feet, not at water. The creek drag found nothing. The only sighting that produced a specific location, Devil's Nest. put Alfred somewhere no toddler goes alone, with someone no one could identify. And then a ransom note arrived months later. Hoax or not, someone wrote it. Someone knew the Beilhartz name, knew the park, knew the story well enough to attempt an extortion. That person was never found. Alfred's father never accepted the drowning explanation. He said publicly, for the rest of his life, that he believed someone had taken his son. His parents returned to Rocky Mountain National Park to search. They kept returning. They kept looking until they were too old to look anymore. No body was ever recovered. No remains were ever found in that creek, in those woods, or anywhere in that park. That is the last confirmed fact in Alfred Beilhartz's case. A 4-year-old boy on a narrow trail along Fall River. Bloodhounds that stopped for no reason. A figure on a clifftop no child could reach. And 86 years of silence. And the next case starts just 20 years later, at a Catholic summer camp on the edge of that same park. A 10-year-old boy disappeared there in 1958. His remains were eventually found. But a piece of his skull spent the next 60 years locked in a private home, passed from one man to his son, sitting in the dark while investigators closed their files and the world moved on. That case is worse, because someone knew. Someone always knew. August 15th, 1958. Camp St. Malo, Estes Park, Colorado. Camp St. Malo sat on the boundary of Rocky Mountain National Park, in the foothills above Estes Park, at roughly 7,500 feet. It was a Catholic youth camp. Wooded, remote in the way mountain camps always are. Close enough to the park that the wilderness began just past the tree line at the edge of the property. Bobby Bizup was 10 years old and had been enrolled there for the summer. By every account available, he was a normal, active kid. There were no recorded behavioral issues, no distress before that day, nothing to suggest what was about to happen. The camp director's account was straightforward. Bobby had gone fishing with counselors and a group of other boys. On the walk back to the lodge, he didn't follow. The counselors realized he was missing and reported it to camp staff. A search began almost immediately. What followed was a full-scale mobilization. Military personnel, local police, National Park Service rangers, and civilian volunteers all joined the effort. They searched the campgrounds, the surrounding forest, across the park boundary, the trails radiating out into the wilderness from the property's edge. They searched for days. Bobby Bizup was not found. The following summer, the summer of 1959, hikers came across some of Bobby's remains. Not near the camp, not near the trails that had been searched in the days after his disappearance. The remains were found several miles west of Camp St. Malo, high on the face of Mount Meeker at approximately 11,000 feet in elevation. That is more than 3,000 feet above the camp. It is not a place a 10-year-old reaches on his own during a fishing trip. The cause of Bobby's death was never definitively established. The circumstances of how his remains ended up on that mountain were never explained. The case was filed and went cold, and for decades, that was where it stayed. Now this is where the case turns dark. In 2021, the National Park Service Investigative Services Branch reopened the investigation. What prompted it was something that no investigator had been able to account for before. A piece of Bobby Bizup's skull had surfaced. It had been identified as very likely belonging to Bobby, and when investigators traced where it had come from, the answer was a private home. The skull had been in the possession of Dr. Joseph McCloskey, a Catholic church member and a close personal friend of the priest who ran Camp St. Malo. McCloskey had died in 1980. When he died, the skull passed to his son, Tom. Tom McCloskey kept it. For decades, that piece of a 10-year-old boy's skull sat in a private home, while Bobby's case sat in a file somewhere and his family had no answers. What finally broke it open was a documentary. Tom McCloskey watched a documentary about Bobby Bizup's disappearance and recognized the skull. He came forward. The skull was recovered and turned over to investigators. Here's what makes this case impossible to set aside. 3 counselors from Camp St. Malo were later confirmed as having sexually abused children in their roles as Catholic priests. 3 of the adults responsible for Bobby Bizup's care that summer were later convicted abusers. Whether that abuse is directly connected to Bobby's death is officially unknown. Whether the skull was retained deliberately to conceal evidence of a crime is officially unknown. Why a piece of a missing child's remains was in the personal possession of a friend of the camp's founding priest, that is officially unknown. What is known is this: Bobby Bizup went missing on August 15, 1958. His remains were found on a mountain no child reaches alone. His skull spent the next 60-plus years in a private home. The National Park Service investigation is ongoing. No one has been charged. His father is long dead. His family waited 6 decades for answers they still don't have. And somewhere in the records of Camp St. Malo, in the private correspondence of men who are now also dead, there may be an explanation for why a 10-year-old boy ended up 3,000 feet above a summer camp on the face of a mountain. That explanation has never been made public. February 13, 1983. Cameron Pass, Colorado. The pass sits at 10,276 feet, on the northern edge of Rocky Mountain National Park, where the road climbs through the Medicine Bow Mountains and the wind comes off the high peaks in waves. In February, it is not a place that forgives mistakes. The snowpack is deep, the slopes are steep, and the terrain above the tree line shifts between avalanche chutes and wind-scoured ridge lines that look stable until they're not. Rudy M knew all of this. That's the part that makes his disappearance so difficult to explain away. M was 27 years old, a ski mountaineer from West Germany. He had traveled to Colorado specifically for the backcountry. He was experienced, not a casual tourist who'd wandered off a groomed trail, but someone who understood high-altitude winter terrain and had the skills to operate in it. He left a trip plan. He had a route in mind. He set out from Cameron Pass alone on February 13th, and he did not come back. When he failed to return to his vehicle, a search was launched. Rangers and rescue teams went into the terrain above the pass. The conditions in late February at that elevation were what they always are: punishing. Deep snow, limited visibility, avalanche risk on the steeper faces. The search teams found no tracks beyond a certain point. No equipment, no clothing, no sign of motor at all. At some point, the search was suspended. He was presumed dead. The case was filed. The German government was notified. And then 37 years passed. 37 years of summers and winters cycling through Rocky Mountain National Park. Millions of visitors, seasonal ranger patrols, trail crews working the backcountry routes every year when the snow melted. Rudy M's case stayed open. Officially, the German government had never closed it, but nothing surfaced. No hiker stumbled across a piece of equipment. No snowmelt season revealed anything on the slopes above Cameron Pass. For nearly 4 decades, the mountain kept him completely. Here's the critical detail. In August 2020, park rangers discovered skeletal remains in the same general search zone where teams had looked in 1983. Alongside the remains, skis, poles, boots, and personal items. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was brought in to assist with identification. The German government was notified again this time with an answer. The remains were confirmed as Rudy Motors. The official position on cause of death is that he likely died from exposure and/or a fall, and that position is not formally confirmed, meaning no definitive determination has been publicly released. What the terrain suggests is this: Cameron Pass in February, solo, above treeline, on steep avalanche-prone slopes. The most probable explanation is that he was caught in something, a slide, a fall, an injury he couldn't recover from, and that the snowpack buried him in a location just slightly outside the corridor of the 1983 search had been able to cover. But here's what doesn't make sense. The area where his remains were found had been searched during the original operation. Not nearby, the same zone, which means either the 1983 search missed something in difficult conditions, or Motors' remains were in a location that wasn't accessible or visible at the time, possibly buried under several feet of snow that didn't give him up until decades of freeze-thaw cycles finally shifted the terrain enough to expose what was left. 37 years. The park was never closed, never restricted. People skied those slopes. Hikers worked those drainages every summer. And Rudy Motors' skis sat frozen in the same mountain the whole time, invisible, waiting. His case is technically resolved now. He has been identified. His family in Germany, after nearly 4 decades, received confirmation of what they had probably known for a long time. But the exact circumstances of how a 27-year-old experienced mountaineer died on a known route in a park full of people who never found a trace of him for 37 years. That remains, officially, unknown, as the mountain kept its secret for longer than most people would believe possible. And it only gave it up by accident when a ranger happened to be in the right drainage at the right time of year. That's the thing about the Colorado backcountry. It doesn't hide things on purpose. It just doesn't feel any particular obligation to give them back. The next case moves out of the wilderness and into a small mountain town. Silver Plume, Colorado, 1988. A sports writer on a leave of absence, living in the back of an abandoned church, writing a novel about a man who had already disappeared from that same town the year before. 1 week after that first man's body was found, shot in the head, his dog beside him. The sports writer went for a day hike in gym shoes and was never seen again. Over 10,000 man-hours of searching and 0 physical evidence. The strangest coincidence in Colorado missing persons history, or something much worse. August 7th, 1988. Silver Plume, Colorado. Silver Plume is a small town, very small, fewer than 200 residents, tucked into a narrow mountain valley at 9,100 feet, just south of Interstate 70, where Clear Creek cuts through the rock. There's a main street, a scattering of old Victorian buildings left from the mining era, and mountains rising steeply on every side. It is exactly the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where a stranger stands out, and where a disappearance should be impossible to keep quiet. Keith Reinhard was 50 years old when he arrived there in the spring of 1988. He was a sports writer for the Daily Herald out of Algonquin, Illinois, a professional, a married man, someone with a career and a life back home. He had taken a 90-day leave of absence. His friends described him as a free spirit, someone who needed space sometimes, who found something in the mountains that he couldn't find anywhere else. He set himself up in the back of an abandoned Catholic church on the edge of town. He sold matted photographs to cover his expenses. And he was writing a novel. The novel was about Tom Young. Tom Young had been a bookstore owner in Silver Plume. In September 1987, less than a year before Reinhard arrived, Young disappeared. His body and the remains of his dog were found in July 1988, just outside of town. Both had been shot in the head. Young's death was officially ruled a suicide. The dog's death was never explained, and no one has publicly accounted for why a man who shot himself also shot his dog, or how. The ruling stood. Reinhard was working out of Young's former storefront when he arrived in Silver Plume. He had become interested in Young's story, interested enough to build a novel around it. 1 week after Young's body was found, on August 7, 1988, Keith Reinhard went for a hike. He told people he was heading to the summit of Pendleton Mountain, a trail that climbs south of Interstate 70 into steep forested terrain above the tree line. He was wearing casual clothing, gym shoes, not hiking boots. He had no survival gear, no radio, no equipment beyond what you'd bring on a warm weather walk. He expected to be back. He did not come back. The search that began on August 8th was substantial. Hundreds of volunteers and professional searchers were deployed across the terrain around Silver Plume and the Pendleton Mountain Corridor. Air resources were brought in. Ground teams worked the slopes in organized grids. By the time the search was officially suspended on August 14th, they had logged over 10,000 man-hours. That is not a small search. That is one of the most intensive efforts a case like this would typically receive. They found nothing. Not a piece of clothing, not a footprint beyond the trailhead, not a single physical object that could be connected to Keith Reinhard. In a search that covered 10,000 man-hours of terrain in a small mountain valley, there was no trace. Zero. Now this is where the case turns dark. Because here is what you have to hold in your mind at the same time. Two men, connected to the same storefront in a town with a population under 200, vanished or died in back-to-back years. Young's body turned up shot, ruling suicide, with an unexplained second death, the dog, alongside it. Reinhard disappears 1 week after Young's body is found, while writing a novel about Young's disappearance. And Reinhard leaves no trace whatsoever, despite a search that dwarfs what most cases ever receive. The timing is the thing. 1 week. Young's body is discovered in July 1988. Reinhard is gone by August 7th. Whether that timing means anything, whether these cases are connected in any way, is officially unknown. The Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office still carries the Reinhard case as open. In 1990, Unsolved Mysteries aired a full episode covering both Young and Reinhard, and it generated no confirmed leads. Keith Reinhard has never been found. No remains, no gear, no explanation. A man in gym shoes on a day hike, in a small valley surrounded by people who were actively looking for him within 24 hours, simply ceased to exist. His son placed a memorial plaque somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. The inscription is his father's own words: "I want to wander till I die. With the mountains as my living room, my only roof, the sky." The novel Keith Reinhard was writing about Tom Young, the man who disappeared from Silver Plume, whose body came back shot, whose dog came back shot alongside him. That novel was never finished. It sits unfinished somewhere in a file, if it still exists at all. A story about a man who vanished, written by a man who vanished, in the same town, from the same storefront, are 1 year apart. The next case leaves the mountains entirely and moves into the desert of southwest Colorado. A man on vacation with his wife, a tourist trail that is barely a quarter-mile long, an afternoon with perfect weather and no reason for anything to go wrong. Dale Steeling walked down that trail and stepped off the edge of the world, and 60-plus searchers couldn't find a single sign of where he went. June 9th, 2013. Mesa Verde National Park, Colorado. Mesa Verde sits in the far southwest corner of the state, near the Four Corners Junction where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet at a single point. The park is built around the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans. Massive stone structures tucked into the overhanging canyon walls, some of them 600 to 800 years old. Preserved in the dry desert air like the people who built them simply stepped away for a moment and never came back. The canyon system below the mesa is deep and broken, full of ledges and sheer drops that are invisible from above. And the Ute Mountain Reservation territory begins at the canyon floor. When Chief Ranger Farias described searching that terrain later, he put it plainly: if someone fell into that canyon system, into the spaces between the rock formations, even helicopters flying directly overhead would not be able to see them. That is the landscape where Dale Stilling disappeared. Stilling was 62 years old, from Goliad, Texas. He and his wife Deneen had planned a 3-week road trip through the national parks of the American Southwest. One of those retirement trips people spend years looking forward to. But they had been methodical about it. June 9th was day 4 of the tour. They had driven to Mesa Verde from the Four Corners area, and by every account, the day was going well. At some point in the morning, Dale told Deneen he was going to walk down to Spruce Tree House. It is one of the park's most accessible and visited cliff dwellings. A trail that is steep but reportedly only a quarter-mile long. A path that thousands of tourists walk every season without incident. He told her he expected to be back in about 20 minutes. 2 hours passed. Deneen raised the alarm. Park rangers responded and began a search of the Spruce Tree House Trail and the surrounding area. And here is where the terrain becomes the story. Because Mesa Verde is not what it looks like from the road. From above, and it appears to be a mesa with trails running along it, manageable, contained, well patrolled. But the canyon walls drop sharply off the edge of those trails, and the drop-offs are not always visible until you are already at the edge. A step off the path in the wrong direction doesn't lead to a slope you can scramble down. It leads to a fall into a canyon system where the ledges catch things and hold them, invisible from above and inaccessible from below without specialized rope teams. The search that followed lasted 2 weeks. Over 60 rescuers were deployed. Helicopters flew the canyon corridors. 2 dog teams worked the trail and the surrounding brush. Rope teams rappelled off the cliff faces, descending into terrain that required technical equipment just to access. Chief Ranger Farias, Vicas, who oversaw the operation and would later describe this as the case that stayed with him longer than any other in his career, kept Dale Stilling's photo on his wall for years afterward. He acknowledged directly what the search teams were working against. If he fell off a cliff, if he fell in between a rock area, unless you were looking straight down, even helicopters would not see him. That is not a hedge or an excuse. That is an accurate description of what mesa and canyon terrain does to a search operation. A body 20 feet off the trail in that landscape, caught in a rock formation on a canyon wall, can be completely invisible from the air and unreachable by foot without knowing exactly where to look. Dale Stilling's wife, Deneen, did not accept that explanation as a reason to stop looking. She publicly criticized the search effort when saying that rangers had spent just 2 days properly searching before scaling back operations. The National Park Service shared case files with the family. The investigation continued as a cold case, but by any operational standard, the terrain had already won. Here's what doesn't make sense about this case. The Spruce Tree House Trail is a quarter-mile long. It is one of the most walked paths in Mesa Verde National Park, not a backcountry route, not a technical scramble, not a trail that requires any particular fitness or experience. It is a tourist path in a heavily patrolled park on a clear afternoon. And a 62-year-old man with no reported medical history, no reason to leave the trail, and every reason to return to his wife simply did not come back. No personal effects were found at any point on the trail. No dropped item, no hat, no water bottle. Nothing that would indicate a specific place where something went wrong. The trail itself gave up nothing. The most probable explanation, and it is a theory, not a confirmed finding, is that Dale Shelling stepped off the trail near one of the canyon drop-offs, either accidentally or in response to some kind of medical event, and fell into the canyon system below. If that happened in the right location, he could be within a quarter-mile of the trailhead and completely invisible to any search effort that doesn't know exactly which rock formation to look behind. Whether Dale Shelling ever reached the Spruce Treehouse ruins is unknown. Whether he left the trail before or after seeing them is unknown. The canyon below the mesa may hold that answer, lodged in a place that decades of patrols and seasons of changing light have not yet illuminated. Danae and Shelling drove away from Mesa Verde National Park alone. The cliff dwellings are still there. The stone walls, the wooden beams, the handprints pressed into the plaster by people who built that place and then, one day, left without explanation. The Park Service has never offered a satisfying account of where Dale went. The trail is still open. Visitors still walk it every season, a quarter-mile down and a quarter-mile back, 20 minutes. No reason for anything to go wrong. That is the last confirmed fact in Dale Shelling's case. A man who told his wife he'd be back in 20 minutes, on a trail so short it barely counts as a hike, in a park full of rangers and tourists and helicopters, and then nothing. The next case is different in almost every way, except one. No mountains, no canyon trails, no wilderness terrain to blame. The next case starts in a Walmart parking lot in Pueblo, Colorado, just before midnight, on a night in February, when a 21-year-old woman had already seen the best thing that had ever happened to her. She had the ultrasound photo in her bag. She had texted it to her family that morning. She drove 2 hours south to see the man who was going to be her baby's father, parked in that lot, and sent him a text to say she was there. And that is almost the last thing anyone ever confirmed about Kelsey Shelling. February 4th, 2013, Pueblo, Colorado. The day had started well. Kelsey Jean Shelling was 21 years old, living in Denver, working at a floor and decor store in Highlands Ranch. She had gone to the doctor that morning for her first prenatal appointment, 8 weeks pregnant. The ultrasound confirmed it, and she sent the picture to her family, her mother, her stepfather, people who were already planning around this baby, already building toward September when the due date was set. By every account of that morning, Kelsey was in good spirits. She was proud. She was looking forward. After her appointment, she went to work. She clocked out at 9:54 in the evening. Then she got in her black 2011 Chevrolet Cruze and drove south on Interstate 25, 2 hours down the highway toward Pueblo to see Dante Lucas. Lucas was her on-again, off-again boyfriend, the father of the child she was carrying. The relationship was complicated in ways her family understood only in pieces. He wasn't happy about the pregnancy, she had told people. Sometimes he threatened to take the baby from her. Sometimes things seemed fine. She had confided these things to people close to her. But she drove south anyway. Because that's what you do when you're 21 and pregnant and trying to hold something together that keeps slipping. She arrived at the Walmart on Northern Avenue in Pueblo shortly after 11 at night. She texted Lucas from the parking lot. She was there. She waited. Around 11:45, she texted him again. She was tired of waiting. He texted back and told her to come to a street near his grandmother's house instead. That is the last confirmed text sent from Kelsey Shelling's own phone. The next morning, February 5th, her phone went straight to voicemail. Her family called and called. Her mother, Laura Saxton, couldn't reach her. By the 7th, 3 days after Kelsey had driven south, the first physical evidence surfaced, and it immediately made no sense. Surveillance footage captured Kelsey's black Chevy Cruze being picked up from the Walmart parking lot at 7:20 in the morning. The driver was an unknown male, wearing a hooded sweatshirt, sunglasses, and gloves. At 5:30 that same morning, before the car was even picked up from Walmart, it had already been dropped at St. Mary Corwin Medical Center in southern Pueblo. Surveillance there showed a driver pulling it into the lot, locking it, and walking away. When the car was eventually processed, several items were missing: a black rosary, a metal sign that read "Love," a tie-dyed teddy bear, and the keys. The phone charger was still there. Her wallet was still there. Her clothes were still in the apartment back in Denver. Here's the critical detail. The same day the car surfaced, someone used Kelsey's debit card at an ATM in Pueblo and withdrew $400. When investigators pulled the ATM surveillance, the face on the footage was Donte Lucas. Lucas was arrested on identity theft charges. The charges were eventually dropped. His story about what had happened the night of February 4th changed with nearly every interview. Sometimes he said they had met around midnight. Sometimes he said closer to 2 in the morning. Sometimes he said they argued in her car in the Walmart parking lot and she drove away. Sometimes he said they went to his grandmother's house first. The timeline shifted. The details shifted. The location of their last interaction shifted. But in every version, Kelsey left on her own, and he had nothing to do with whatever came next. Her phone battery died on February 7th. After that, there was no activity on her bank accounts, no movement on her social media, no contact with anyone. She had left her apartment in Denver exactly as it was. Nothing packed, nothing removed, no indication she had planned to go anywhere beyond a single overnight visit to Pueblo. Kelsey Shelling was never seen again. The investigation that followed moved slowly. Too slowly, according to Kelsey's family. The Pueblo Police Department was the lead agency, and in the early weeks, the response felt inadequate to the people who loved her. Laura Saxton described walking nearly every street in Pueblo herself in those first months, covering ground on foot because she didn't trust that it was being covered any other way. She organized search efforts. She talked to anyone who would listen. She kept the case visible at a time when it would have been easy for it to slip into the backlog of missing persons files that agencies carry and rarely revisit. In 2015, the family filed a civil lawsuit against Donte Lucas, members of his family, and the Pueblo Police Department, citing the way the early investigation had been handled. The lawsuit contained fragments of the police record, text messages between Kelsey and Lucas in the days before she drove south, details about the welfare checks officers had conducted, timelines reconstructed from phone data. It was one of the only public documents that gave any window into what investigators actually knew when the suit was later dropped. But not before it had put certain facts into the public record that the department had not released on its own. One of those details came from a co-worker of Kelsey's at the Floor and Decor store. About 6 months before Kelsey disappeared, she had failed to show up for a shift. When her colleagues finally reached her, she told them she couldn't come in because she had bruises on her neck. She said her father had strangled her. Investigators looked into it. Her father, Doug Shelling, denied it, and they were able to confirm he had been hours away at the time of the alleged incident. He was ruled out. But that left an open question that was never publicly answered. If Doug Shelling didn't cause those bruises, who did? The source of the neck injuries Kelsey described to her co-worker 6 months before she vanished remains officially unknown. In December 2017, 4 years and 10 months after Kelsey Shelling drove to Pueblo and never came home, Dante Lucas was arrested for her murder. He was already in custody at the Pueblo County Detention Center on an unrelated aggravated robbery charge when detectives served the warrant. The Pueblo Police Department stated that the arrest was the result of evidence accumulated over nearly 5 years of investigation, and that her body had not been found. They did not release details of what that evidence was. Lucas was charged with first-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. The trial proceeded in early 2021. The lead Colorado Bureau of Investigation investigator who had worked the case testified that in his assessment, Kelsey had been strangled, a method that would explain why no murder weapon was ever recovered and why no blood evidence had been found at any location connected to Lucas. The prosecution's theory was that Lucas had lured Kelsey to Pueblo with the intention of killing her, knowing about the pregnancy and unwilling to be bound to it. The car staging at St. Mary Corwin Hospital, driven there by an unidentified male before it was picked up from Walmart, suggested that at least one other person may have been involved in the hours after Kelsey's death, though the identity of that individual has never been publicly confirmed. In March 2021, Dante Lucas was convicted of first-degree murder, as the sentence was mandatory: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kelsey's mother stood in that courtroom and received the outcome she had spent 8 years working toward. It was not what she had wanted. What she had wanted was her daughter. Because here is the thing the conviction did not change. Kelsey Shelling's body has never been found. Searches of properties connected to Lucas, including an excavation of the backyard of a home he had previously lived at, an operation that involved heavy equipment and the removal of a tree, produced no remains. A search of a nearby field produced no remains. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation joined the effort. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had resources on the case. Across years of investigation, with a convicted murderer who knows the answers sitting in a prison cell, but no one has found Kelsey. Her mother, Laura Saxton, used the grief of that fact to build something. She created Colorado Missing Persons Day, an annual recognition of families still waiting for answers, still searching, still carrying the weight of a case that technically has a verdict, but still has no ending. The bench at Pueblo City Park, near the playground, has Kelsey's name on it. Laura Saxton has said she cannot have closure, not without knowing where her daughter is. Dante Lucas is in prison for the rest of his life. He knows where Kelsey Shelling is. He has not said. The next case follows the same shape almost exactly, same state and the same outcome. A woman vanishes. A man is convicted of her murder. Her body is never found. But this one starts on Thanksgiving morning with a surveillance camera at a grocery store, a 1-year-old in a shopping cart, and a text message about sweet potato casserole. By the time anyone realized Kelsey Berreth was missing, 10 days had already passed, and the person responsible had spent those 10 days building a trail that led 600 miles in the wrong direction. November 22nd, 2018. Woodland Park, Colorado. Woodland Park sits at 8,465 feet in Teller County, 35 miles west of Colorado Springs, in the shadow of Pikes Peak. It is a small mountain city. Tidy streets, a grocery store, a community that knows itself. The kind of place where a young mother and her toddler walking into a Safeway on Thanksgiving morning is unremarkable, ordinary. The kind of thing that happens 1,000 times a day in 1,000 towns across the country. And at 12:30 in the afternoon on November 22nd, 2018, surveillance cameras at the Woodland Park Safeway captured Kelsey Berreth pushing a shopping cart through the store with her 1-year-old daughter Kaylee riding in the seat. Kelsey was 29 years old. She was a licensed flight instructor at DOS Aviation in Pueblo, a skilled pilot who filed flight plans meticulously. Her family would later emphasize this detail, the precision of it, the way she never traveled without telling someone where she was going. She was engaged to Patrick Frazee, a horseshoeing contractor with a 35-acre ranch in Florissant, about 15 miles away. Kaylee was their daughter. She bought sweet potatoes. On her way out, she texted Frazee. She'd bought sweet potatoes in case he wanted a casserole for Thanksgiving dinner, so it is the most ordinary possible detail. A woman buying groceries for a holiday meal, texting her partner, her baby, in the cart. She sounded happy when she spoke to her mother by phone that morning. Normal mom-daughter conversation, Cheryl Berreth would later describe it. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested what was already in motion. At 1:23 in the afternoon, a neighbor's surveillance camera captured Kelsey, Frazee, and Kaylee entering Kelsey's townhome together. Kelsey was carrying a poinsettia plant she had picked up at Safeway. That image, the three of them walking through the door, a poinsettia in her arms, her daughter beside her, is the last confirmed footage of Kelsey Berreth alive. Now, what happened inside that townhome between approximately 1:30 and 3:30 in the afternoon is the center of the prosecution's case against Patrick Frazee. The theory, supported by testimony given at trial, is that Frazee beat Kelsey to death with a baseball bat in her home while Kaylee was in another room. That is a theory, not a confirmed forensic finding. Kelsey's body has never been found, and the physical evidence recovered at the scene was enough to establish that investigators believed a crime had occurred there, but not enough to reconstruct exact events. What is confirmed is that Kelsey Berreth walked into her home at 1:23 in the afternoon and was never seen or heard from in any verifiable way again. The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days later. On November 25th, Kelsey's employer at DOS Aviation received a text from her phone saying she would not be in the following week. That same day, cell tower records showed Kelsey's phone pinging off a tower near Gooding, Idaho, 600 miles north of Woodland Park, across Utah and into the southern part of the state. Frazee told investigators he had received texts from her phone that day as well. The implication, if you didn't know better, was that Kelsey had left, gone somewhere, decided to take some time away. It was not Kelsey sending those texts. Frazee had a secret. He had been in a relationship with a woman named Crystal Lee Kenny, a nurse from Twin Falls, Idaho, who had been quietly woven into his life alongside his engagement to Kelsey. In the months before Thanksgiving 2018, Frazee had approached Kenny 3 separate times with requests to kill Kelsey Berreth. 3 times. The first attempts involved Kenny traveling from Idaho to Colorado. She had gotten close enough to deliver a coffee to Kelsey at her home while pretending to be a neighbor and considered poisoning it. She didn't go through with it. None of the 3 attempts succeeded. Eventually, according to Kenny's testimony to investigators, Frazee handled it himself. After Thanksgiving, Frazee gave Kenny Kelsey's phone. Kenny drove it back through Colorado, into Utah, and home to Idaho. The phone pinging off cell towers the entire way, building a data trail that suggested Kelsey had traveled north of her own volition. Kenny also sent texts from the phone to Frazee and to Kelsey's employer on maintaining the fiction that Kelsey was alive and simply away. It was a deliberate misdirection, constructed carefully, and it worked for 10 days. On December 2nd, Kelsey's mother Cheryl reported her daughter missing after days of unanswered calls and texts. Officers conducted a wellness check at the townhome. Both of Kelsey's vehicles were in the driveway. Her suitcases were inside. Food had been left on the table. Her toothbrush was still there. Only her phone and purse were gone. Items that, it would later become clear, Frazee had ensured were removed from the scene as part of the cover. That 10-day gap between Kelsey's death and her family's missing persons report was not carelessness on anyone's part. It was the result of a carefully built deception. Texts sent from her phone, a story about her traveling, a fiancé who presented himself as cooperative and concerned. The critical first week, when evidence is freshest and trails are warmest, passed while investigators didn't yet know there was anything to investigate. Patrick Frazee was not subtle about what he wanted. That is, in retrospect, one of the most unsettling things about this case. Not that a man killed his fiancée, but that he had been trying to get someone else to do it for months before he did it himself. And that process left a trail of witnesses who knew exactly what he had been planning. Margaret Luce, a customer of Frazee's horseshoeing business, told investigators that Frazee had spoken openly to her about wanting to raise Kaylee without Kelsey. He said he just wanted her gone so he could raise their daughter with someone else. That is not a passing frustration. That is a stated intention, said to a client, months before Thanksgiving 2018. Luce came forward after Kelsey disappeared. Crystal Lee Kenny, when investigators finally reached her in Idaho in late December, agreed to cooperate. What she described in her recorded interviews was methodical and premeditated in a way that made the Thanksgiving timeline feel less like an explosion and more like the conclusion of a long, deliberate process. Frazee had recruited her to kill Kelsey 3 separate times between September and October 2018. She had traveled from Idaho to Colorado on each occasion. On one visit, she had gotten close enough to Kelsey to hand her a coffee, intending to poison it. She couldn't do it. The plan fell apart each time. And so Frazee, according to Kenny's testimony, undid it himself on Thanksgiving afternoon with a baseball bat in Kelsey's home, while their 1-year-old daughter was in another room. Kenny told investigators that Frazee burned the evidence at his ranch. Kelsey's body, the bat, the bloody clothing, using gasoline in a burn pit on the Florissant property. She described watching him pour gasoline and feed material into the fire. She said he had spoken about disposing of the remaining ash in a landfill or a river. That testimony drove the subsequent search. Law enforcement, the Woodland Park Police Department, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Teller County Sheriff's Office served a search warrant on Frazee's 35-acre ranch. They found teeth, they found bloody sheets. They recovered dozens of items, and whether the teeth were Kelsey's was not publicly confirmed at the time. The ranch was excavated. The Waste Management Midway landfill south of Fountain, Colorado was searched. A massive, resource-intensive operation that required working through tons of material. Kelsey Berreth's remains were not found. On December 21st, 2018, exactly 29 days after Kelsey was last seen alive, Patrick Frazee was arrested at his ranch and charged with first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, and tampering with a deceased human body. He was held without bond. He entered a plea of not guilty. The trial began in November 2019. The case against Frazee rested heavily on Crystal Lee Kenny's testimony. She had pleaded guilty to evidence tampering in exchange for cooperating with prosecutors, and what she knew was the connective thread between Frazee and the crime. As a University of Colorado law professor who followed the case put it, the case lived and died on Kenny's account. There was no body. There was limited physical evidence directly tying Frazee to Kelsey's death. What there was a witness who said she had watched the aftermath, had helped cover it up, and had agreed to 3 separate murder plots before the 4th one succeeded. On November 18, 2019, Patrick Frazee was convicted of first-degree murder on all counts. The sentence was life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 156 years on the remaining charges. He was 30 years old. He has never said where Kelsey is. The 2 Colorado Bureau of Investigation agents who worked the case gave an interview after the verdict. One of them, when asked what still unsettled him about the case, said simply, "Why? Not how, not who, why?" Why did Patrick Frazee decide that the answer to a relationship he no longer wanted was murder? Planned over months, executed on Thanksgiving Day, while their daughter was 20 feet away. The agent said he would never stop looking for Kelsey's remains. As of last public reporting, they have not been found. Kelsey Berreth was raised by Kelsey's family. The ranch in Florissant still stands. Frazee is in a Colorado prison, and the answer to where her body is sits with him in that cell, declining to be spoken. The next case takes us back into the wilderness, back to Rocky Mountain National Park. This time, it is 2019, after the dead of winter, and a 70-year-old man who had been coming to this park every winter for 3 years in a row parked his car at the Glacier Gorge trailhead, picked up his camera, and walked into the snow alone. Between the moment he left and the moment his family realized he was missing, 2 feet of fresh snow fell on everything he might have left behind. February 28, 2019. Glacier Gorge, Rocky Mountain National Park. James Pruitt was 70 years old, from Etowah, Tennessee. He had retired to a life that included winter trips to the Colorado Rockies. This was his 3rd consecutive winter visit to Rocky Mountain National Park. He knew the Bear Lake area. He had hiked it multiple times that same week. He had arrived at the park on February 22nd and had been out on trails nearly every day since. By the time he set out from the Glacier Gorge trailhead on the morning of February 28th, he was not a stranger to this landscape. He was a repeat visitor who had put in enough hours to know the trails, the distances, the way the light worked in the valley. He was carrying a Nikon Coolpix 900 camera. He was wearing a dark blue jacket and a red or orange beanie. He set out at approximately 10 in the morning. He did not tell his family in Tennessee where specifically he was going that day. That is the detail that would haunt the search. No stated route, no destination shared with anyone. A man who had been hiking this park for a week, who knew the trail network around Bear Lake and Glacier Gorge well enough to move confidently through it, who set out alone on a cold February morning without telling a single person which direction he planned to walk. He never returned to his vehicle. Between February 28th and March 3rd, the day his car was finally noticed sitting at the Glacier Gorge trailhead, 2 feet of snow fell across the entire search area. 2 feet of fresh accumulation blanketing every trail, every drainage, every off-trail corridor where a person might have walked or fallen. Whatever tracks James Pruitt had left on February 28th were gone by the time anyone knew to look for them. The snow had reset the entire landscape. Every surface clue, every potential scent trail, every footprint in the forest, erased. On March 3rd, rangers identified the vehicle at the trailhead and contacted Pruitt's family in Tennessee. His family confirmed he had been in the area and that the last time they had heard from him was Thursday morning, February 28th, at approximately 10 in the morning. The search began that same day. What followed was one of the most resource-intensive search operations in recent Rocky Mountain National Park history. The active search ran from March 3rd through March 9th and covered approximately 15 square miles. The Glacier Gorge drainage, the Lock Vale drainage, the Glacier Creek drainage, Alberta Falls, Nymph Lake, Chaos Creek, Lake Hayaha, Mario's Gully, the winter trail corridors toward Mills Lake and the Lock, Sky Pond, Flat Top Mountain. Between 30 and 50 search and rescue personnel were in the field each day, drawn from the National Park Service Team, Larimer County Search and Rescue, Rocky Mountain Rescue, or a Diamond Peak Ski Patrol, Douglas County Search and Rescue, the Alpine Rescue Team, and multiple specialized dog teams. A state multi-mission aircraft flew fixed-wing aerial reconnaissance with heat-sensing capability over the high-elevation terrain. The conditions they were working in were brutal. Off the packed trails, searchers were encountering chest-deep snow. Wind gusts hit 40 miles per hour on exposed ridgelines. The drainages, the Glacier Gorge Drainage, the Prospect Canyon Corridor, were choked with dead and downed timber, thick willow, and mountain streams running under unstable snowpack. Moving through that terrain at search pace in those conditions required physical effort that limited how much ground each team could cover in a day. On March 15th, the broad-scale search was officially suspended. 0 clues had been found. Not a piece of clothing, not a camera strap, not a glove caught on a branch. Nothing. But the search did not stop entirely. Through the summer and fall of 2019, smaller targeted teams continued working specific segments of the search area as conditions improved and the snowpack receded. Each time the snow melted from a drainage or a boulder field or a forested corridor, search personnel went back in to examine what the winter had been covering. Each time, nothing. On October 9th, nearly 7 months after Pruitt had disappeared, 50 personnel were deployed for one final major push, concentrated in the Prospect Canyon Drainage and the Glacier Gorge Drainage above Jewel Lake, areas of thick timber and heavy undergrowth that had been difficult to penetrate in winter conditions. When that search found nothing either, James Pruitt remains a missing person. His camera, the Nikon Coolpix 900 he had carried specifically to photograph this landscape he kept returning to every winter, has never been found. His intended route on February 28th is unknown. Whether he left the maintained trail system is unknown. Here's what doesn't make sense, held against everything the search teams did. Heat-sensing aerial surveillance was deployed over terrain that in late winter would have minimal warm body interference from wildlife. 50 trained personnel combed 15 square miles across multiple operations spanning 7 months. A man who knew this park, who had walked these specific trails days before he disappeared, left no trace that any of those resources could locate. Then his car sat at the Glacier Gorge trailhead in the snow. 50 searchers combed 15 square miles across 7 months of operations. Nobody found a single footprint, a single fiber, a single photograph from the camera he was carrying when he walked away from that parking lot on a February morning and didn't come back. The last case on this list is the most recent. 2023, an experienced trail runner, 49 years old, sets out from the west side of Rocky Mountain National Park on a 28-mile route across the Continental Divide. He sends 2 texts from inside the park, location data attached, alive and moving. Then the mountain goes quiet, and every piece of technology deployed to find him comes back empty. Some things about this park have not changed at all. September 28th, 2023. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado. The North Inlet Trailhead sits on the western edge of the park just outside Grand Lake, at the point where the paved road ends and the backcountry begins in earnest. It is not a trailhead for people who are uncertain about what they are walking into. The terrain from that starting point climbs steadily eastward through dense subalpine forest, breaks above the tree line into open tundra, and then commits fully to the exposed high country where the Continental Divide runs along the park's central spine. At that elevation, above 12,000 feet, the landscape changes its terms. The trail markers thin out. The wind is constant. The distance between a manageable afternoon and a life-threatening situation compresses to the width of a weather front. Chad Palanche understood this, for he was 49 years old from Fort Collins, a trail runner with marathon experience and a history of technical routes in Colorado's high country. The plan he had built for September 28th was ambitious. 28 miles, west to east, North Inlet trailhead to the Bear Lake area, crossing the Continental Divide through the park's interior. He had not previously run this specific route, but the individual components, the trail systems, the terrain types, the divide crossing, were within the range of what a runner of his background and fitness would approach as a serious but achievable objective. He was not underprepared in the sense of being reckless. He was attempting something hard. He parked his vehicle at the North Inlet trailhead and set out into the park. The first text came from near Mount Alice, and Mount Alice sits in the Wild Basin section of the park's southern interior at just over 13,000 feet. Deep in, above the tree line, in the exposed high country, where the route would cross its hardest terrain before beginning the descent toward the east side. The text placed Palanche alive and moving at a specific location. He was en route. He was making progress. The second text came later and placed him approximately 7 miles from the Bear Lake area on the east side. The final stretch of the route, the closing segment before the end point. After the second text, there was nothing. He did not arrive at Bear Lake. His vehicle remained at the North Inlet trailhead. Family contact was made. Rangers were notified. The search began. The resources assembled were modern and substantial. Air reconnaissance flew the corridor between Mount Alice, the divide crossing, and the Bear Lake approach, the defined zone that the two texts had bracketed. Drones covered sections that fixed-wing aircraft couldn't examine at low altitude and close range. Heat-sensing technology was deployed over the high country, looking for a living person or for remains in terrain, where a body in dark running clothes could be completely invisible to standard visual search. Dog teams were placed at multiple trailhead access points along the route. Ground teams worked the sections of the trail system that remained accessible from the east side. Then the weather changed the calculation entirely. Late September in the Colorado high country operates on its own schedule, and that schedule does not accommodate search operations. Snow arrived across the park's upper elevations within the active search window. Not a light dusting, real accumulation, the kind that closes exposed terrain to foot travel above the tree line. Ground operations above tree line became dangerous and then impossible as conditions deteriorated. The search shifted to aerial only as the terrain shut down for foot teams. The same front that may have caught Palanche on or after the divide crossing was now actively working against every effort to find him. Here's the critical detail that makes this case distinct from a simple bad weather accident. The two texts Palanche sent provided something that most backcountry disappearances never offer: confirmed location data at 2 points along a defined route. Text 1 near Mount Alice. Text 2 7 miles from Bear Lake. So that is not a missing person somewhere in 415 square miles of park. That is a missing person in a corridor that can be drawn on a map with reasonable confidence. Heat-sensing aerial surveillance flew that corridor while conditions still permitted it. It found nothing. Hold that against what the technology was looking for. Heat-sensing aerial surveillance in late September, before significant snowfall has buried the landscape, is looking for thermal contrast, a warm signature against cold ground, or the residual heat pattern of a body that has been in place for hours or days. In terrain with limited wildlife interference at that elevation and season, the signals should be relatively clean. The corridor was defined. The technology was deployed. The result was empty. The most logical explanation for that outcome, and it remains a theory, not a confirmed finding, is that Palance entered terrain off the primary route corridor at some point after the second text, in a location that placed him outside the search zone that the texts had defined. The divide crossing and the descent from it toward Bear Lake involves sections of loose rock, steep couloirs, and uneven technical ground that trail running shoes navigate differently than mountaineering boots. A fall in that terrain, a twisted ankle, a rock slide underfoot, a slip on frost-covered rock in deteriorating conditions, could produce an injury that stops forward movement entirely at an elevation where overnight exposure without shelter is not survivable. Or the weather arrived faster than the timeline suggests and caught him on the exposed ridgeline before he could descend to sheltered terrain. Late September on the Continental Divide in Rocky Mountain National Park is a place where temperatures can drop 30 degrees in 2 hours and wind can make standing upright difficult. A trail runner moving at pace generates heat that masks the early stages of hypothermia until forward movement stops. When it stops, the math changes quickly. What happened to Chad Palance in the hours after his second text is unknown. The corridor between that final confirmed location and his intended endpoint at Bear Lake holds the answer. It is a specific piece of geography, not infinite, not unknowable in principle. But in practice, the winter that followed the search closed it off entirely. The Rocky Mountain National Park received 14 feet of snow in the season that followed September 28, 2023. The high country above the tree line, the divide crossing, the couloirs on the eastern descent, the exposed tundra sections of the route, went under that accumulation and stayed under it through the winter. Whatever the terrain holds from that afternoon, it held it through 14 feet of snow and an entire Colorado winter. His vehicle remained at the North Inlet trailhead through all of it. On the eastern side of the park, the Bear Lake area continued operating normally. The winter crowds, the snowshoe rentals, the families photographing the frozen lake. 7 miles away, on the other side of the divide, somewhere in the corridor between Mount Alice and that final endpoint, the last chapter of Chad Palance's story sits in terrain that has not yet chosen to reveal it. Whether his remains have been located in the time since the initial search is not confirmed in publicly available reporting as of the most recent research available. The case is recent enough that the answer to that question may have changed. What is certain is that a 49-year-old experienced trail runner sent 2 texts from inside a defined route corridor, then went silent, and every piece of modern search technology deployed in the window before the weather closed and the high country came back with nothing. There is a particular kind of grief that belongs specifically to the families of missing persons. And it is different from the grief of loss in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside it. When someone dies, and you know it, when there is a body and a burial and a place to go, the grief is enormous, but it has a shape. It occupies a defined space. The missing persons' families on this list have not been given that. What they have been given instead is a permanent uncertainty that sits alongside everything else in their lives, every morning, every ordinary Tuesday, every holiday, and does not resolve. Laura Saxton knows her daughter is dead. Dante Lucas was convicted of Kelsey's murder in March 2021 and is serving a life sentence. That verdict is real, and she fought for 8 years to get it, walking the streets of Pueblo herself in the early months because she didn't trust that anyone else was covering the ground. She created Colorado Missing Persons Day from the wreckage of those years. An annual recognition of families still in the waiting, still searching, still carrying cases that have no physical ending. The bench at Pueblo City Park has Kelsey's name on it. A grandbaby was born around the time Kelsey's baby was due. Laura Saxton has said they would have been the best of friends. She still does not know where Kelsey is. The man who knows is in a prison cell and has chosen silence. And that silence is the thing she lives alongside every day. Kelsey Berreth stood at a press conference in December 2018 and said into the cameras, "Kelsey, we just want you home. Call us if you can. We won't quit looking." She said it the way mothers say things when they are trying to hold the door open just a little longer, just in case. The door has not been opened from the other side. Kelsey's daughter Kaylee is being raised by Kelsey's family. Patrick Frazee is in a Colorado prison serving life plus 156 years. He has not said where Kelsey is. He will die in that prison. The answer to where her body is will die with him unless something changes, and nothing has changed. Alfred Beilhartz's parents went back to Rocky Mountain National Park for decades after July 2nd, 1938. His father said publicly for the rest of his life that he believed someone had taken his son. He died without an answer. The creek trail along Fall River still runs through the park. The elevation called Devil's Nest on Mount Chapin is still there. The ledge where two hikers reported seeing a small boy seated at the edge and then jerked back by someone standing just out of view. No one was ever identified. No one was ever charged. The bloodhounds that stopped at 500 feet in the middle of a trail for no explained reason. That detail has never been accounted for. 87 years later, there is no answer to what happened to a 3-year-old boy who was there one moment and gone the next. Bobby Bizup's family waited 63 years for a piece of skull to come out of a private home. 63 years during which the National Park Service investigation sat in a file. The camp counselors who would later be confirmed as abusers lived their lives and died their deaths. And the priest who ran Camp St. Malo was commemorated and mourned in the way that men of his position are commemorated and mourned. Tom McCloskey watched a documentary and recognized what his father had kept in the house, and came forward, and the skull was recovered. The National Park Service Investigative Services Branch reopened the case. No one has been charged. The circumstances of Bobby's death remain officially undetermined. 3 of the adults responsible for his care that summer were later confirmed child abusers. That fact sits in the public record and has not produced a charge or a conviction or an explanation. Rudy Motor's family in West Germany waited 37 years for confirmation of what they had almost certainly known for a long time. His skis and poles and boots sat frozen in the Cameron Pass terrain through 37 winters. Through the reunification of Germany, through decades of seasonal visitation to that section of the park, through the careers and retirements of the rangers who had searched for him in 1983. And then a ranger walked into the right drainage in August 2020, and there he was. The German government was notified. The remains were recovered. The cause of death was listed officially as likely exposure and slash or a fall, with no formal confirmation. His family received the closure of identification. The exact story of what happened on the mountain on February 13, 1983, was not recovered along with his equipment. That part stayed in the terrain. Keith Reinhardt's son placed a memorial plaque somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. The words on it are his father's own. "I want to wander till I die. With the mountains as my living room, my only roof, the sky." The Clear Creek County Sheriff's Office still carries the case as open. The novel Reinhardt was writing about Tom Young, the man who disappeared from Silver Plume in 1987, whose body came back shot, whose dog came back shot alongside him, was never finished. It sits unfinished in whatever file or box still holds Keith Reinhardt's belongings. A story about a man who vanished, written by a man who vanished, from the same storefront, 1 year apart. Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode about both of them in 1990. 35 years later, there are no confirmed leads. Denian Steeling drove away from Mesa Verde National Park alone on June 9, 2013. She had come to Colorado with her husband on a 3-week retirement trip, methodical and planned, the kind of trip people spend years looking forward to. Day 4, a quarter-mile trail that Dale said he'd walk in 20 minutes. 2 hours later, 60-plus searchers, helicopters, rope teams, dog teams, 2 weeks of operations, and nothing. The chief ranger who oversaw the search kept Dale's photo on his wall for years. The canyon below the Spruce Treehouse Trail drops into terrain where, as that ranger acknowledged directly, even helicopters cannot see what the rock formations are holding. Denian criticized the search. The National Park Service shared files with the family. The case is cold. Dale Steeling has never been found. James Pruitt's family in Etowah, Tennessee, last heard from him on February 28, 2019, at approximately 10 in the morning. When he told them he was heading out for a hike, they knew he had been coming to Rocky Mountain National Park every winter for 3 years. He knew the trail network around Bear Lake and Glacier Gorge. He carried his camera. He did not say which way he was going to walk. 2 feet of snow fell before anyone knew to look. 7 months of search operations across 15 square miles found nothing. His camera is still in that park somewhere, if it still exists in any recoverable form, holding photographs of whatever he pointed his lens at in the hours before he disappeared. Chad Palanche left 2 texts in a defined corridor on September 28, 2023, and then went silent 7 miles from his endpoint. Modern search technology flew that corridor and found nothing. The winter closed the high country. 14 feet of snow followed. Whatever happened between the second text and the Bear Lake area, in that specific bounded piece of geography that should be findable in principle, has not yet been found in practice. 9 names, 9 places, a creek trail, a summer camp, a ski route, a mountain storefront, a cliff dwelling path, a city parking lot, a grocery store on a holiday, a winter trailhead, a divide crossing. The geography of Colorado runs through all of them like a spine. The mountains and the canyons and the small towns and the parks that receive millions of visitors a year and still, in ways that resist explanation, manage to keep what they take. This is the thing about Colorado's missing persons history that no single theory accounts for cleanly. Some of these cases have verdicts. Some have remains. Some have nothing at all. No body, no cause, no final confirmed location, no moment you can point to and say, here, this is where it ended. What they all share is the silence that follows the last confirmed fact. The moment when the trail stops producing information and the unknown begins. Pull up the map, trace the routes. Estes Park in the summer of 1938. The boundary of that same park in August 1958. Cameron Pass in February 1983. Silver Plume in August 1988. Mesa Verde in June 2013. Pueblo in February 2013. Woodland Park on Thanksgiving 2018. Glacier Gorge in February 2019. The Continental Divide in September 2023. 9 routes, 9 silences. Colorado gets 300 days of sunshine a year, 400 miles of mountain range. The most visited national park in the country. Every year, millions of people walk in. The map is still open. None of these routes have an ending.